Her hand hovered over the car door, polished nails catching the evening light, when a voice cut through the parking lot like thunder. "Don't get in the car." Everyone froze. The CEO turned, expecting defiance. But what she saw was the janitor in blue overalls, arm raised, eyes locked on her with a stare that said everything wasn't as it seemed. The parking lot buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the clicking of expensive heels on asphalt. Employees stood in little clusters, eager to see their CEO step into her sleek black sedan and drive away, the image of power and control. She was elegance wrapped in authority, the kind of figure no one dared interrupt. Then it happened. "Don't get in the car." The words tore through the evening air like a crack of thunder. Heads snapped around instantly. The commanding voice was raw, desperate, filled with an urgency that could not be ignored. The CEO froze mid-step, her hand hovering inches above the chrome door handle. Her manicured nails gleamed under the fading light. Her back stiffened. Slowly, deliberately, she turned toward the sound. Her sharp eyes, accustomed to boardroom battles, searched for the fool who had just dared to shout at her. And there he was, Ethan Cole, the janitor, the man who spent his days emptying trash bins and mopping floors in silence. So invisible, most employees barely remembered his face. Now he stood tall in his faded blue overalls, rubber gloves still on, his chest heaving as though the shout had drained something out of him. His right arm was raised, palm out, stopping her as if his word alone had the power to halt danger. For a moment, silence consumed the lot. Then, like water dripping into a still pond, whispers rippled through the crowd. "Did he just yell at her?" One voice hissed. "He's out of his mind," another muttered. "He's finished. Nobody talks to her like that." The CEO's lips parted, her pride bristling. She wasn't a woman used to hesitation. She was used to compliance. Anger rose in her chest, hot and sharp, and the retort formed in her mind. "How dare you?" But something about his eyes stopped her. They weren't the eyes of a man trying to be bold or reckless. They were locked on her with an intensity that made the air heavy. His stare was unflinching, urgent, the kind of look that wasn't about respect or defiance. It was about warning. She felt it before she understood it. A pulse of unease, a flicker of instinct telling her to listen. Ethan's voice came again, lower this time but firm, steady like a command he had no choice but to give. "Step away from the car, ma'am." The employees tensed. Some exchanged amused glances, waiting for the CEO to lash out and cut him down with a single sentence. Others leaned in, curious, their eyes gleaming with expectation of humiliation. The CEO straightened her shoulders, torn between pride and instinct. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes waiting for her to punish him. Yet, for reasons she couldn't quite name, her feet shifted backward. Not far, just a step, but enough to put space between her and the car. Ethan let out a slow breath, but his jaw remained tight, his body still rigid. The storm wasn't over. And in that moment, without anyone realizing it, the balance of power shifted. Ethan moved quickly, his boots scraping against the pavement as he approached the car. The murmurs of the crowd swelled around him, a tide of disbelief and judgment pressing in from every direction. But he didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the sedan, every step carrying a heaviness that came from more than suspicion. It came from memory. He crouched low by the driver's side, the rubber of his gloves squeaking faintly as his hands brushed against the undercarriage. The ground was rough beneath his knees, but he didn't notice. His breath came slow and deliberate, each inhale steadying his racing thoughts. The CEO stood rigid a few feet away, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her heels planted on the asphalt like anchors. She wanted to demand an explanation, to assert her authority, but something in Ethan's movements, the care, the precision, made her pause. The onlookers weren't so restrained. "What's he doing?" a young intern whispered, stifling a laugh. "Checking the car? He's a janitor, not a mechanic," another scoffed. "He's going to embarrass himself. Just wait." But Ethan didn't hear them. Or maybe he did, and simply refused to care. His gloved fingers slid along the metal, pausing when he felt the faintest slickness beneath his touch. He stilled. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, the laughter dying down. Slowly, carefully, Ethan withdrew his hand. The glove glistened with a dark, oily residue that caught the last rays of daylight. His jaw clenched, and his eyes hardened. For a second, he didn't move, staring at the smear on his palm as though it were a ghost dragging him back into the past. When he rose to his feet, his expression was grim, carved with the certainty of a man who had seen this before and wished he never would again. His voice carried across the lot, stripped of hesitation. "This car has been tampered with." The word struck like a hammer blow. A collective gasp swept through the employees. Heads turned. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. Even the CEO's breath caught, her stern mask faltering for the first time. "What do you mean?" "Tampered?" someone asked, almost afraid of the answer. Ethan's gaze swept over the crowd, then returned to the CEO. His voice was firm, steady, but heavy with unspoken weight. "The brake lines. Someone cut them." Silence crashed down on the lot, thick and suffocating. The meaning hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. If she had stepped into that car, if she had driven off, her life would have ended within minutes. The CEO's heart hammered in her chest. Her hand, still hovering near her side, trembled as she looked at the sedan. She could almost see herself behind the wheel, smiling faintly as she pulled away, unaware she was driving toward her own death. Her eyes snapped back to Ethan. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a janitor. She was looking at the only reason she was still breathing. The revelation hit the lot like a thunderclap, but the silence didn't last long. Whispers ignited almost immediately, bouncing from one employee to the next until they swelled into a chorus of disbelief. "He can't possibly know that." "Brake lines? Really? How would he even see that? He's just a janitor. Maybe he staged this." The words carried sharp edges, each one a barb meant to cut Ethan down before the weight of his discovery could lift him up. People shifted uneasily, torn between the fear that he might be right and the comfort of dismissing him as nothing more than what they believed he was, an invisible man with a mop. The CEO felt the doubt pressing in, a tide threatening to swallow the strange clarity she had just felt. She glanced at the car, then back at Ethan, her mind racing. She had built her life on facts, on numbers, on the visible and verifiable. And here was this man, covered in oil stains, speaking with absolute certainty, but holding no proof in his hands other than the black smear on his glove. Her assistant stepped forward, her voice sharp and clipped, the tone of someone who knew exactly how to defend their superior's dignity. "Are you accusing someone of trying to harm her? Do you even have proof?" The crowd hushed, waiting for Ethan to falter. The assistant's words were the ones they had all been thinking but hadn't dared to say aloud. Now they watched for the moment when his confidence would crumble. Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, steady and unwavering. He didn't shout this time. He didn't defend himself with anger. He simply stood, shoulders squared, breathing deeply through the pressure of dozens of skeptical stares. His silence in that moment was louder than their questions. But still, the murmurs returned. "This doesn't add up. Why now? Why here? Convenient, isn't it? He's probably trying to make himself look like a hero." The CEO listened, torn between the loyalty of her people and the instinct tightening in her chest. She looked back at Ethan, studying the grim set of his jaw, the calm that seemed to harden around him instead of break. There was no performance in his stance, no pride in his words, just certainty. And though she didn't yet know why, she found herself wanting to hear what he would say next. All eyes pressed down on Ethan like a weight. The employees wanted an explanation, the CEO's assistant demanded one, and even the CEO herself, though silent, waited with that sharp gaze that could cut through excuses like glass. Ethan inhaled slowly, the oily smear still staining his glove. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, carrying the even tone of a man who had repeated these words in his head long before this day. "I don't need proof," he said. "I know sabotage when I see it." The assistant scoffed, ready to pounce, but he continued before she could strike. His eyes moved from her to the CEO, locking on the one person who truly needed to hear him. "I used to work auto mechanics before this job. 20 years. I've seen brake lines fail. I've seen what it does to people behind the wheel, and I can tell you, this wasn't wear and tear. This was cut, clean, deliberate." A ripple went through the crowd. The whispers didn't vanish, but they softened, bending under the weight of his conviction. Some employees looked at each other uneasily, their certainty wobbling. The CEO tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. For the first time since his shout had stopped her in her tracks, She spoke directly to him. Her tone was calm, stripped of arrogance, carrying only the steel of a woman used to cutting through pretense. How did you know to check? The question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. If he couldn't answer, if he faltered now, the fragile ground he had gained would collapse beneath him. Ethan's jaw tightened. His gaze dropped for just a heartbeat, as though pulling strength from somewhere deeper than the lot they stood in. When he looked back at her, his eyes carried a weight that silenced the restless crowd. "Because I noticed a man lurking near this car earlier," he said. His voice was softer now, but no less firm. "Something felt wrong. And I promised myself after my wife died, I'd never ignore my gut again. Not when it comes to protecting someone." His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, before he steadied it. The confession landed in the silence like a stone breaking the surface of still water, sending ripples through every heart listening. The murmurs faded. Even the assistant, once bristling with suspicion, closed her mouth. The CEO studied him, something shifting in her gaze. Not yet trust, not yet belief, but recognition. For a long moment, no one moved. The parking lot, once filled with whispers and gasps, was now gripped by a silence so heavy that even the faint hum of nearby traffic felt muted. Every pair of eyes stayed locked on Ethan, waiting, wondering what weight sat behind the words he had just spoken. The CEO's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone expected. "You lost your wife." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't planned to open this wound in front of strangers, hadn't meant for the memories to spill out in such a raw place. But the truth had been pressing against his chest for years, and now it demanded to be spoken. He nodded once, slowly. "Yeah." His voice was low, steadier than he felt. "Car accident. Faulty brakes." The words cut sharper than any accusation. Gasps fluttered through the crowd, softer this time. Not disbelief, but the sound of hearts shifting. The CEO's hand, still tense at her side, curled faintly, her composure faltering as the image hit her. A man watching helplessly as the person he loved was stolen by the very failure he had just described. Ethan continued, each word deliberate, like he was placing stones across a river he had never dared to cross until now. "My little girl only has me now. She was barely old enough to understand what happened. I promised her that day, promised myself, I'd never look away again. If something felt wrong, if I saw danger, I wouldn't stay silent. Not ever." His voice thickened, but he pressed forward, forcing the words into the air, each one an anchor. "I already lost one family to a car I couldn't save. I won't let it happen again. Not to anyone." Silence swallowed the lot once more. The mocking looks, the doubtful whispers, all of it had dissolved. No one shifted uncomfortably now. No one dared break the weight of the confession that had turned a janitor into something else entirely before their eyes. The CEO's gaze softened. The sharpness, the pride that usually framed her expression, gave way to something rawer, more human. She saw not just a man in overalls, but a widower carrying a vow forged in tragedy. And in that moment, Ethan was no longer invisible. The CEO stood still, her eyes fixed on Ethan as though trying to reconcile the man before her with the image she had held in her mind all these years. A janitor who blended into the background, who existed only at the edges of her world. Now, with his confession hanging in the air, that picture no longer fit. For the first time in her career, she hesitated not because of doubt in herself, but because of the undeniable certainty in someone else. The employees watched, breathless, expecting anger, dismissal, or at the very least a sharp retort. But instead, the CEO moved forward. Each step was measured, deliberate, the click of her heels echoing across the hushed lot. When she stopped in front of Ethan, the crowd tensed. A woman of her stature, lowering the space between herself and a janitor, was unheard of. But she didn't flinch, and neither did he. Then, to everyone's shock, she extended her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and clear. Gasps swept through the crowd. No one had expected gratitude. No one had expected humility. Yet here it was, unfolding before their eyes. "You didn't just save my life," she continued, her gaze locked with his. "You honored your wife's memory." Ethan froze, the weight of her words sinking deep. He had braced himself for ridicule, for dismissal, for the sting of being told he was out of place. Instead, her words cracked something inside him, a release he hadn't known he needed. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he reached out and clasped her hand. His grip was firm, but his shoulders eased for the first time since he had shouted his warning. His eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with the overwhelming reality that, for once, someone had truly seen him. The employees shifted uncomfortably, their earlier whispers replaying in their minds like shameful echoes. Some looked down, unable to meet the scene before them. Others watched with awe, their assumptions shattered. The CEO, still holding his hand, turned toward the crowd. Her voice rang out, sharp and commanding, the way it did in boardrooms when she laid down decisions that could not be contested. From this day forward, she declared, this man is not just a janitor. He is the reason I am standing here alive, and I will not tolerate anyone treating him as less than invaluable. The words cut through the air like a blade, slicing apart the last strands of doubt. And in that moment, Ethan Cole stood taller than anyone had ever seen him stand. The CEO's words still hung in the air, echoing through the stunned silence of the parking lot. The crowd shifted uneasily, shame flickering across their faces as they replayed their earlier scoffs, their cruel whispers about the man who had just saved a life. Their arrogance now felt hollow, exposed in the light of his truth. Ethan stood motionless, the CEO's grip still firm on his hand. For years, he had walked these halls unseen, his work unnoticed, his existence reduced to the background hum of cleaning carts and the smell of disinfectant. Now, in front of the very people who had overlooked him, he stood as the center of gravity. The CEO released his hand only to place hers firmly on his shoulder. Her eyes, sharp yet softened by sincerity, met his with an unwavering respect. Her voice dropped, steady but intimate enough that everyone still heard. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he said quietly, as though unused to being addressed in this way. He swallowed, then added, "Ethan Cole." She nodded once, as if committing it to memory, then raised her voice again so that no one could miss a word. "Well, Ethan, consider this your last day as a janitor." The crowd blinked, caught off guard. Murmurs sparked again, but this time they were different, uncertain, expectant. "Tomorrow," she continued, her tone rising with conviction, "you'll be working in security. My security. A man who can see danger before anyone else belongs by my side." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, slowly at first, a few hands began to clap. Hesitant, unsure. But one by one, the applause spread until it rolled across the lot like thunder, filling the space with something far greater than gossip. Respect. Ethan's chest tightened. He had never sought this, never imagined it. He had only wanted to keep a promise, to his wife, to his daughter, to himself. Yet here he was, elevated by a moment of instinct, transformed in front of those who had once barely seen him. His eyes burned, and he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Instead, he nodded once, sharply, holding his composure even as gratitude swelled inside him like a storm. The CEO leaned closer, her words meant only for him this time. "You saved me, and now I'll make sure you and your daughter never struggle again." The promise hit him harder than any applause. For so long, he had carried the burden of survival alone, piecing together a life for his little girl with the scraps left by tragedy. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight lift, just enough for him to breathe. The employees stood in silence, humbled, watching a man once invisible rise before their eyes. Ethan Cole, janitor, widower, father, no longer blended into the background. He stood taller than them all, not because of rank, but because of the courage to shout when no one else would. And that day, everyone learned. Never underestimate the voice that dares to speak when silence is easier.